Hi, I'm Ben.
And I'm Carl.
And you're listening to Secret Sonics. Honest conversations chock full of tactical advice to help you build your dream career in music and audio.
Whether it's skill development, mixing mindsets, personal branding, or work-life balance, we talk about ways to help set yourself up for success in the ever-changing music industry.
Let's get started.
Today's a little bit different, and I think this is going to be something very special because we are beginning our new series of interviews where Ben and I have been sitting down with some amazing producers and engineers and honestly, amazing humans to get nerdy and also get a little philosophical about life in the music industry. Before we started doing these interviews, Ben and I made the conscious decision to not do profile sorts of interviews. We thought we could dive into some really deep topics if we just dive into the deep topics, you know? So that's why I'm recording this little intro after we did the interview with today's guest, Nick Nagurka, who is the man. Honestly, just a wonderful, sweet, ridiculously talented teddy bear of a human. I love him so much. He's an engineer and mixer from Traverse City, Michigan, where he mixes remotely, runs Theo Katzman's Cinnamon Ranch studio, and also tours occasionally doing front of house. Nick's worked with artists like Theo Katzman, Vulfpeck, Yola Tango, and even on some projects with CeCe Winans, The Bad Plus, and Robert Randolph and the Family Band. We dove deep into what it's like working with Theo and the Vulfpeck crew and really trying to capture those insane one-take performances that everybody's recorded live in the room. Even the vocals are done live without overdubs. It's a crazy process to go through, but holy crap, the results are incredible and they speak for themselves. So without any further ado, let's listen to part one of our conversation with Nick Nagurka here on Secret Sonics. Hi, Ben. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Carl.
Hi, Carl. Hi, Nick.
Yeah. There's people in the call and the stuff, and there's other people, and it's great. Hi. I'm so happy. We've been talking about doing an interview episode for a while now, and just logistically, it has been difficult just for Ben and I internally to be able to get it to work out. And thankfully, when we asked the lovely, talented, handsome beast of a musician and engineer, Nick Nagurka, to come on as our first duo guest, you were very, very kind and agreed to it. So, Nick, holy cow, thank you so much.
Oh, I'm stoked to be here. Thanks for asking me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being our first guest in Secret Sonics 2.0 land.
Woo!
Okay, so we just want to get right into it. Nick seems to have a specialty in terms of recording live bands, and we want to know how it all works and how he's able to get it all going. So this is going to be maybe like a two-part episode. The first part is going to be talking about the technicalities of recording people live in a room, and the second part is going to be talking about getting people comfortable and ready to do that take live as it happens. So, Nick, maybe we should start with like drums, because getting drums to sound good in a room with a lot of people can be a challenge. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your approach to tracking drums in the context of a live recording session?
Sure. Well, I guess I should preface by saying that to get a good drum sound, the drums have to sound good through the vocal. That's like the most important thing. And that's the thing that escaped me for years when I was younger. It's pretty easy to deny the idea that, well, I've got this great drum sound, everything's tight and close, I've got all the close mics really dialed in, everything's in phase. And then you turn on the vocal and it sounds like trash. So to me, the most important part of getting a good drum sound is getting the bleed to sound good in all the other instruments. And that really, to me, means getting everyone in the same room, balanced, listening to each other, and then sort of mitigating bleed as you can. But it really starts with a really great sounding room. So we work a lot on the room, and then everything else just sort of comes together because people aren't wearing headphones. So I know that was a roundabout answer, but I would say starting with getting good drum tones, really for me, it's like, at least at Theo's place, I do it pretty much the same similar approach every time when we're recording live. It's low overheads, spaced pair, measured to be sort of equidistant between the kick and snare plane, kind of a George Massenburg technique or Bill Schnee technique, if you will. Usually they end up being kind of weirdly placed where like the one over the floor tom is actually lower than the one over the rack tom, but they're kind of centered on the toms. And we just kind of switch it up, you know? It's just usually one or two mics on the kick, spot mics on the toms, spot mic on the snare, maybe something below, but it never really stays the same, But I do feel like the drum sound and the overheads in particular are sort of the basis for the entire of the whole recording. And there's a lot less bleed in the drum overheads than you'd think in some of these rooms. Like, we just did a record out there recently where we're going pretty loud. And if everyone's balanced, the bleed is super balanced in the drums, really. And it's more of a question of just sort of mitigating the drums, getting into everything else.
This just makes me think about how you must have a very unique relationship with bleed, where you've kind of become friends with bleed. And you have tried to almost like tame the wild beast, but knowing that if you can get the bleed to sound good, then you can get the song to sound good. Whereas I think most engineers assume that bleed is always a bad thing and is always something that ruins a song. And if anything, you're using it as a way to make sure that everything feels good in the song and in the room, because if it feels good in the bleed, it's going to feel good in the mix.
Totally. And I feel like bleed is really kind of the character that glues it all together. It's the thing that gets you that ambiance that you can't really manufacture with a plug-in or even with like a chamber or a physical room mic. You can't really, I don't know. I mean, I guess you could really. You could set up say like a Fire M69 dynamic mic as if you're recording an acoustic guitar next to the drums, but there's not going to be a person in front of it playing a guitar that's resonating and doing its thing. Some of our favorite sounds have just been kind of happy accidents. It's like, oh, we have this like Neumann head that we like to use for a lot of things now. And sometimes it'll just be parked in a corner and you're like, oh my God, that's the Neil Young guitar sound, basically. And I know that's not the secret to his guitar sound, but it's like, that's that roomy thing and it's parked right next to the drum kit. And it just works. I don't know why it works. You get lucky sometimes. And
yeah,
got to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think snare sympathetic vibrations from me are really what can make or break the vibe of a live track and whether it feels live or not. And something that I do, because I was a session drummer for a long time, but now I'm primarily mixing like pop and like electronic based music. So whenever I'm working with things that are meant to sound live, even if they were live drums that ended up through processing and the production kind of get a little bit of the life gated out of it a little bit too much.
Or sample replaced.
Or sample replaced, or sample reinforced, or some combination. I've always been a fan of reamping all of the shells through, like, reamping it through a snare drum. And not just the snare to get like the snare crack, but like reamping the kick track through a snare drum, reamping the toms through a snare drum. And just to kind of get that, because as a drummer, nothing sounds more uncomfortable than hitting a kick drum with the snares turned off.
Yes.
Like in the room. And it's just because that snare buzz is part of a kick sound. That snare buzz is part of a floor tom sound. And otherwise it sounds like they just sound like multiple sized basketballs. And I imagine that when you're saying about having, the guitar player isn't there next to that mic, like you're not hearing the bass making the floor tom vibrate, which is making the snares buzz. When that is, so much of the vibe and what really makes older records sound the way that they do, and why newer records that try to fake that with overdubs just don't get there.
Totally. It feels like it falls flat. And I feel like when you're trying to like really ape something, you're trying to like go for the sound of like an endemic sound of a genre. There's nothing more boring to me, to be honest. It's like, oh, you're going for Motown. Well, you're not in that house. You're not with that group. I just want to go for something that sounds timeless and good. And that happens from just kind of getting everybody in the same room, going for the best thing that the song can be. And how it turns out is how it turns out,
And also like the balancing of the musicians in the room without headphones. People sort of intuitively know how to do that, because if you've ever played in a band, you know how to like turn yourself up or down and just like figure that out. And so like there's definitely something there also in terms of like getting that balance totally right amongst the musicians in the room without the headphones. That's like, it's badass. It's like almost, that's not even done anymore, but Nick is doing it. Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about mic choices. When I had Phil on the show, he was telling me about using omnidirectional mics in order to get a better sounding bleed. Is this something that you're also into? Is it slightly different in your case? And or do you have any particular like microphones that you like to use for vocals where you think drums sound really good and as bleed?
Well, I think Phil and I have kind of different schools of thought on that a little bit. But our overhead placement choices, like it was funny when he was having me set up overheads for Theo's record. I was like, oh, this is exactly how I do it. I get it. Cool. Let's do that. But I rarely choose omnis, probably just because I'm a little bit of a scaredy cat of like having too much bleed or not being able to really walk it back. So I prefer cardioids for overheads, like those, the Soyuz 013s. Just got a pair of bee's knees. It's like their U67 clone. And sometimes I'll open them up from cardioid to maybe wide cardioid. On a couple of tunes that were like more organic on this most recent record we did, I opened them up to Omni, and I opened up the piano mics. I put Omni capsules on the piano mics as a spaced pair too. And it's amazing. The cool thing about Omnis is that you just get insane low frequency response. It's not exaggerated, but it goes down through the floor. And I love that. But it's not always appropriate for the way I record drums, so I prefer a much more sort of focused thing. And after working with Theo for a few years, I've noticed that he really does. We're kind of aiming more towards like really tight drum sounds and really sort of touchable, to use his words for that. But yeah, I like the Soyuz and the bee's knees for overheads. I'm a big fan of biodynamic dynamic mics like M69 and the M88. And the M69's basically just a M88 with a low cut filter on it, but it's awesome for snare top. We have this Telefunken AR51 tube mic that I like to put in bidirectional mode and just park it under the snare so it captures both the beater side of the kick and the bottom of the snare, and maybe hit that with an 1176 on the way in. Mostly just, some type of large diaphragm condenser that's laying around, I'll put it on kick. Like the Kel HM2D has been a pretty frequent choice. At least in Theo's room, there's not much space inside that kick drum for an inside mic. So maybe I can get something in there, but usually it ends up sounding kind of strange because he's got it so stuffed full of pillows. So it's a very dead sounding drum. But if I need a little more poke, I'll put something in there. Beyer M160s on toms are great just because they sound so natural and they blend really nicely with a brighter overhead. And then for vocals, this is a thing that I struggled with for a long time. And I think a lot of people would say like, oh, we're doing a live track thing. I'm going to use an SM7 or I'm going to use some other tight patterned dynamic mic.
Yeah, or like the RE20 maybe.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem with that is the bleed sounds terrible through those mics. It's just going to sound trashy. And like, they're also kind of specific mics that don't work on everyone. So we've been using like a C37A, which is a pretty dark sounding tube condenser with a pretty low output. So the nice thing with that is that even with a loud band in the room, you're not going to really overload the tube circuit. So it's never going to distort quickly or start to sound pretty gnarly with a ton of extra harmonics. The Soyuz 017 FET is great for that too, because it's also kind of an even dark sounding large diaphragm condenser. It's funny because if I were at like the studio I used to work at and we had like a bunch of U67s, M269s, U47s, M49s, all that stuff, I probably wouldn't choose those for a live vocal. I'd probably choose something that was a little bit lower output and a little bit less aggressive or shiny on top, because those mics are just like, they sound like if you parked them out as a room mic in front of a drum kit, they're going to sound aggressive, almost too aggressive to like put in front of a live band. So yeah, the thought process is something that's going to be neutral and really beautiful, and then get the singer really, really close to it.
Yeah. And just hype it up afterwards.
Yeah. And I'll compress it on the way in. Like some stuff I'm doing 6, 8, 10 dB of compression on the vocal on the way in anyways, and just kind of fuck the bleed, whatever. We can deal with it later. There are ways to deal with it. But yeah, I think you just kind of like, you hear everything in the same space when it's going down, so you know what you can kind of get away with. And sometimes you screw yourself over. But oh well, that's making music, taking chances.
Yeah. I want to take a step back real quick, because you were talking about how Theo described the kind of drum sound you're going after as touchable. And I am always fascinated by the way that artists and producers use very non-sonic words to describe a sonic concept, right? So I really would love to know if you could elaborate a little bit about number one, what does touchable mean in this sense? And also, are there any other new vocabulary words that, you've developed in your time working with Theo?
So touchable to me, and how I've sort of learned what he means when he says this, is I think it really means that the drum sound is all in the overheads. And I completely agree with this. I've always felt this way. The overheads need to be placed with pretty great care so that you're maintaining the sense of imaging in the drum kit that makes sense. I've seen a lot of people, Carl, before I joined your class, I was going to do a video ripping on overhead placement for a minute. But really, it's you kind of want your overheads to be sort of as decorrelated from each other as possible to a certain degree. The further apart they get, the more flat they can get, but the closer they are, the more you kind of want them pointing away from each other. Because a lot of times I'll see photos of mic'd up drum kits and it's two mics pointing like this, both at the snare. And to me, that is the exact opposite of what I ever want to see, because the mic that's supposed to be closest to the hi-hat is pointing at the floor tom and vice versa. And so you get all this phasey garbage that does not sound touchable to me, because it sounds weird and there's no real sense of imaging to me. So for us, it's very much it's measure, listen, move, scoot, repeat. And then just really listening for that thing where that floor tom feels like it's right in front of your face in a certain way. And sometimes we run into problems with that because it's too close. But
so it's if you could close your eyes, you can almost feel exactly where everything is in front of you, as opposed to the kind of smeary. The mics are almost so wide that it sounds kind of mono, kind of thing. Yeah. So it's the distinction of the stereo placement of all of the drums.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's that. And I think it's also having kick and snare really dead center. And that's why you kind of place them on an angle there in relation to the drum kit. And it's tough to visualize without a photo of it, but it basically looks like the overheads are in the wrong place. And it's because the kick and snare are not in front of each other. They're on an angle plane. So you kind of follow that. And that's kind of naturally over the toms. So the toms end up sounding big anyways, because you don't barely need a spot mic to make them big.
Yeah, I think I'm visualizing it finally. It's basically you're centering the snare and the kick, but you're doing a spaced pair and pivoting it, swiveling it.
Yeah, it's almost like a 30-degree angle to the right if you were the drummer.
Right.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Which actually makes sense, because instead of the overheads being in alignment with your shoulders, it's in alignment with the drums themselves. It's almost like they're in alignment over your right leg, assuming you're a right-handed drummer.
Exactly.
Yeah. Epic.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, friend of the podcast and Grammy-nominated engineer/mixer Travis Ferentz hosts Progressions, Success in the Music Industry.
It's a podcast exploring creativity, productivity, and growth in music. Travis has set out to document his own journey and bring those valuable lessons to you to apply to your own career.
Join in each week for conversations with some of the industry's best and brightest about the mindsets and strategies that they use in their careers every day.
Whether you're feeling stuck, digging for inspiration, or just looking for a mix tip, Progressions is probably for you.
Go check it out wherever you get your podcasts, or click the link in the show notes.
Have you ever sent a proposal to an artist and they just ghost you? They never respond to it. You had a really great conversation with them. Everything seemed like they were good to go. They wanted to work with you. But then when you send over the proposal with the price on it, they just kind of disappear off into the ether. I'm teaching a free class on how to sell them on the experience of working with you and why that's so special, why you're so special. Don't worry if you can't make it to the live session of the class, because we're going to be recording it so you could replay it at any time whenever you want. It's called the Platinum Pitch, Proposals Clients Can't Refuse. If you want free access to the class, just click the link in the show notes and get registered today. So are there any other non-audio terms that Theo or some of your other friends use? And if so, what are they? How did you learn to figure out how to interpret that? And then what do you actually do as far as mic placement, positioning, choices? What do you do to actually achieve that?
Totally. Well, I think one of them is something Theo and I used to say a lot was small room. He would just always say, I think we need some small room on that, which is not particularly non-audio, but it's sort of in his mind, that's Valhalla room. And I don't like adding extra space on things that much, unless it's as an effect. And we finally we met on the bridge together on that, on the most recent project we were working on. That was so when Theo got the Neumann binaural head, which is a dummy head with holes cut where the ears are, and it's got like actual ears. That was sort of when it clicked for us of we don't need to add like a small room reverb algorithm on everything to like make it sound like it's in the same space. It's sort of like, oh, you're just capturing the room in the most natural sounding way that our ears could hear it. And that was huge. That was definitely huge in that journey.
Now, where do you
Wow.
place that? Where do you place that, the dummy head?
You just move your head around and put it there.
Good answer.
I have some wild photos. I have some absolutely wild photos of like, wait, that's how you got that? And it's like, Theo's just like, yeah. And I just walked around and it's like, I was playing my guitar and I was like, here. And it's like over his shoulder turned away, you know, with one ear pointed at the guitar. And it's just bizarre, but it just always works.
Yeah, I used to do a lot of recordings in very unideal spaces, and I really like feel like I learned a lot from doing that. And I would always like walk around the room and sort of like sing until like and clap until like I found spots in the rooms that just resonated really nicely, and that would kind of give me a clue of like maybe where I could put a microphone. So I totally I vibe with that.
Yeah.
So when you are setting up for a session, knowing that you're going to have a live band all in the room, no headphones, like this is as snapshot of a moment in time as is possible. Does that still enable you to have any sort of, I guess, like, I don't want to say template because that's like the wrong way to think about it, but like a lot of studios, they'll have one place where the drums go. They have one place where the bass amp goes, right? And with you, with all of the things that you're balancing and also knowing that bleed is such an integral part, like an accepted part of what it is that you're capturing, does that force you to just move stuff around every single time? Like there's just a lot of experimentation based on the instrumentation, or are there some things that you've settled in on? This is going to be here because it always sounds good here. This is it's a crapshoot of where this sounds good. Sometimes it sounds amazing. Sometimes it sounds terrible, and it's just a matter of where do we place it. Like what's that like preparation like setup process like?
Well, I guess you could say our hand is really forced more by ergonomics than it is anything else. Just like Theo's room is really small, you know, versus like I've mixed a couple other records now that are just like, you know, straight live concert captures. And those are sort of a forcing factor of like, oh, like this is just how the band is set up live and that gets tracked that way. But in a small room, it's more like, where can we fit the piano? You know, and then we kind of deal with it later. Or like, where can everyone see each other? Like, where can everyone in the band sort of communicate in their best possible way? And from there, we just kind of move amps around and whatnot. You know, piano, really, it's like, usually just ends up getting mic from behind on the soundboard, usually like an upright piano. So I'll kind of put a stereo mic back there. We have this Vanguard V44S that I love, and just XY, easy to move one mic and just kind of scoot around so that it's at this, you know, the basically centered around the key of where we're playing the song. And then the vocals, you know, depending on what the vocalist plays, they might move around a lot too. And so I'm just scooting their vocal mic around until it's kind of where they are, you know? And sometimes there's a negotiation with video of being like, well, that doesn't look good there. And I have to be like, well, sounds good there. And then they'll be like, well, we might move them over here. And I'm like, okay, fine, I'll deal with it, you know? And then we'll scoot some baffles around or whatnot, you know? But yeah, so much of it is just like, where is everyone comfortable? And then we figure it out from there. And as they're running the tune down, I'll come and I'll move mics or whatever, or say like, could we move this amp here or turn this amp down a little bit or whatever? But usually it's just like everyone's naturally balancing themselves. So the biggest problem is, can they hear each other? Which is sometimes actually hard. Like if you try to blanket off a piano and mic it from the front, then the person playing the piano is going to dig in a lot harder because they can't hear the piano. You know, and then they can't lock in as well with the drummer, say. And so that's harder. So you kind of have to adjust your approach and just be like, okay, we're just going to mic it from behind and blanket off the back so everyone can hear each other, you know?
The priority is really like the musician's experience in the room. And then it's sort of like, how can we get this to sound as good as possible given that context that they're now comfortable to record together in this setup? It's sort of like music
absolutely.
First, sound second, but it's going to be super vibey no matter what. So, hooray.
Yeah. And then you also have those visual considerations, which I think is super interesting too, knowing that there's such a, unnecessary visual component to what Theo is doing that to most people that would seem kind of counter to the ethos of the way that you're recording. but in a way, it's like such an interesting yin yang balance between very raw, very live, all performance, as minimal technology as possible, but it's got to look fucking great on YouTube. You know what I mean? Like it's such an interesting combination of things there.
Yeah, it's been funny. It's also been a journey too. Like we're kind of working on elevating the video game as well. Like we shot on iPhones for a long time. Like I shot all the video for Theo's Be the Wheel album, which is funny. That's me like just kind of like, crouching around on an iPhone, just like shooting 4K and just watching the phone just incinerate in my hands, during the summer. And it's just...
Did you make that weird little grunt sound as you slank around the room like a gargoyle?
Probably, yeah.
It works and it looks great. Like the Vulf aesthetic is definitely a little bit lo-fi. Not that, the Theo project is exactly Vulf, but like that's sort of like what people have come accustomed to with those players,
Totally. And the Vulf thing is like so different too, because like I feel like Jack always kind of lets me do my own thing, but it's basically, I know that if I put up an overhead mic, he's not going to use it. He's going to use kick and snare close mics and that's it. And he's going to compress them so hard that you hear the hi-hat and you hear all the ghost notes and all that stuff. But it's like SM57 and whatever.
Which makes the bleed just as important with that stuff for completely different reasons than why it's important with like Theo stuff.
Totally. It's very different. It's always wild to hear like what he comes up with after the fact. Because it's not something that I do. It's something that's so out of my wheelhouse. And I go, whoa, you completely replaced that keyboard or whatever,
Well, I love that people have their things, right? Like, me and Carl were just talking about this on a recent episode of like, what you do differently is what differentiates you in the marketplace of producers and engineers and mixers and recording people. So you got to just like figure out your thing and go for it. So, I love that there's Jack Strattons in the world, but it's also great that there's Nicks in the world. You know what I mean? So everybody's got to find their little thing that they resonate with and just go for it.
Especially when they complement each other. That's what's
absolutely
so beautiful.
I want to get like one more technical thing before we kind of move on to the more interpersonal part of this conversation with Nick. So everybody's like live in the room and everybody's amped up so that they can hear each other. What's your approach to tracking the bass, given the fact that there's probably an amp in there, but you could do whatever you want? Like, what do you like?
So I bought this tube DI last year to take on tour from Shaw Audio in Nashville. And it's called the Shaw Audio Tube Injection DI or something like that. But they made it it's like a one-off for me. And they make everything custom order. And it's a preamp, 2 preamp transformerless output. So similar to like a Red DI or a Noble, except it doesn't have a transformer in the output. So it sounds a little more open, doesn't have that transformer ring that can kind of be oppressive on some tracks. On some tracks, you're like, wow, this is so fat. And on others, you're like, that's just too much like subharmonic stuff. So I love the Shaw because it has that approach. It's also just a great preamp. It sounds like a bass amp. It's got like just basic EQs for high and low and like a little 3-position mid switch, and you can drive it pretty hard. Sounds amazing. So I just do a DI for the bass, and then we send the bass into whatever spare guitar amp is lying around. And they play really quiet, and we turn the low end down. And then it's like, you just hear the mid-range from the bass. And it doesn't really bleed hardly at all, unless they're like a really loud player. And then I might have to go in and be like, hey, can you turn down a little, just a little, I'm just going to turn you down a little bit. And they're usually cool with it.
Yeah.
How does that affect the groove, though? Like, I mean, I know this is also getting into like the performance side of it. We can maybe save this answer for that section, but I'm wondering, like, as a drummer, I know like feeling the bass and hearing the bass usually happen simultaneously, not one or the other. So have you noticed that that's something that the other musicians need to get used to? As the rhythm section, like locking into really great rhythm section that may not necessarily sound like as big and full of a rhythm section as it will actually be in the control room as you're hearing it.
And I would just add to that question, like as a bass player, how loud you are affects how much you dig in, and that affects the sound dramatically, Like if you're like really digging in, you're going to have a much different waveform than if you're just kind of like doing that soft thing.
Well, it's a tough thing. And I think some players, I think it's a little easier for some players. Like really guys with a really light touch, like my friend Joel Gottschalk who I love, is like a super light touch, like P bass guy. And my friend Brian Lang, also P bass guy, but like plays with a pick. So they have like this really light kind of touch to them. And so they can turn the amp up a little bit louder and you can still hear the percussiveness of it. And it doesn't seem like it affects them that much. For someone like my friend Joe Dart, he really digs in. And so it's like, it's a bit of a different thing because he's digging into an amp that doesn't get very loud. And so I think it's a different experience for either of them. In the end, it's just kind of a game of just slowly balancing over the course of the session. The nice thing is like, there's enough time to get used to it because we'll track for like 7 days or so. And so when you're in the room for 10 hours a day for 7 days, it's like you kind of get a feel of like, okay, this is how we balance each other. And then there might be some songs that it's a little bit more of a challenge if you're trying to rock a little harder. In that case, if the drums are hitting harder, I'll just turn the bass up because it's, they're just balanced against each other to a certain degree. But it's so funny. I never hardly have trouble with bass bleeding into the drums in that room for whatever reason. Maybe it's just, we just got lucky and it's just got to make sure that, the speaker's pointed at their face too, so that you can really hear it, but you're not going to feel it.
Awesome.
I want to ask one more question that I think might hopefully transition out of the technical episode into next week's, more interpersonal performance episode. And this is me as a drummer. I know Ben's a bass player. He got to ask a bass question. I'm going to ask a really specific drum question, but I know as a drummer, I can be the bane of the engineer's existence, especially in a live recording setting. So what are some of the biggest issues that you run into as an engineer, recording the band live and worrying about the drums and making sure that the drums are getting the right amount of volume, the right amount of intentional bleed, right? But what are some of the major issues that you've come across when handling drums in this kind of a situation? And what have you done as an engineer to be able to kind of mitigate that issue and get everything to sound rad?
I would say probably the hardest thing is getting the hi-hat bleed into everything else to not sound awful. Like hi-hat and snare bleed typically, especially just the strainer sound, getting into a vocal or an acoustic guitar mic is really can be rough sometimes. Any sort of mono source that you have bleed into it and then you want to pan it around or turn it up really loud, that's when it gets kind of gnarly. And for that, I get around it with Isotope RX Music Rebalance.
Wow.
I just turn it down 60 dB, just percussion down 60 dB. Use the nice algorithm, whatever it is, and just kind of wait for it to run. And sometimes it really destroys things in a bad way. And you might want to do more than one pass of it. But in a vocal mic, I can usually get 6 or 9 dB down, and then the vocal is just clean and really nice. Same thing in pianos too, but you got to be really careful with the piano, or it starts you get that affected ringing filter sound, especially on a bright piano sound, and it can start to be really unpleasant. The other problem though is sometimes I'll do all that and I'll just put it on a playlist in Pro Tools so I can flip between processed and unprocessed. It brings me back to the quote unquote band in the room saying, which is that's something that Theo and I talk about a lot, is this phrase band in a room. You want it to feel like you're in the room. And the bleed is an important component of that. So sometimes it's maybe we should make this a little trashier sounding, kind of let it bleed a little bit more. But yeah, it's that. It's also having the mics kind of close to the drums. Sometimes you get a really present cymbal sound that if somebody wants a roomier drum sound, that's kind of hard to recreate because it's just the overheads are close. The cymbals are going to sound close, not diffuse. So that's a hard thing. Sometimes maybe I'll throw in a little rim sample on the snare or something like that. Cheat a little bit.
I like that combination of you're doing this really organic recording and people in a room, basically in 2024 as organic as it can be, but you're still able to use machine learning denoising to enhance it, and you're able to sort of also do that A/B comparison of, I was able to do this and it enhanced something, but is it making the overall picture better? And I think a lot of people, we get so zoomed in on something that if we're fixing something, that we get so focused that we forget to check whether it's better or not really in the big context. And I think that's like an important point that you said there. That like you do the work,
Oh, it's so
you see what
important.
happens, and then you can assess. And don't forget to assess, you know?
Well, I bought the plugin, so I have to use it, Ben.
That's right.
Oh my gosh. No, this was great. Do you have any more, I guess before we, sign off for this part of the episode, do you have any other little sneaky tricks that you've learned along the way that you think maybe engineers that are trying to get this kind of a sound can do to get closer to a more realistic band in the room kind of vibe?
Yeah. So I would say two things. It's like, we don't replace vocals. We don't use Melodyne. We don't really even comp that much, but we will do overdubs to embellish things. But for me, it's like, it's all about committing, and you got to listen to the whole band at once. It's like, we had this like 48 channel Midas console for a little while, and I get to the end of a record and we had, 24 ins that we were running in Pro Tools. And I get to the end of a record and every EQ is turned on, because if you want it to sound a certain way, you just do it on the way in. There's no point in like waiting, because you hear the whole band in context and you got to fit it together. So if I need a really aggressive piano sound, like there's this song called Simple Step off the latest Vulfpeck record, where it's just like, I'm kind of thinking this like Saturday in the Park thing. That's just where my brain is going for this. And so I was just like, just go for a really kind of like no bottom end, really plunky, really compressed piano sound and just run it on the way in. And also maybe EQ at some of the drum bleed or whatever. But like just committing to things. I think that's something that like not many people, I would say in more of like a producer, like bedroom producer kind of situation would go for it, because they just have plugins on. But if I have a small amount of hardware, I'm not going to be monitoring with plugins unless it's something that is like something that I don't have. And so like, I think just like really committing to mic placement and just the fundamentals of like, okay, does this sound good? Should I move it? And do I want this to sound a certain way? Well, why would I put it off? Just run the EQ, smash it, do whatever. Because like you want it to sound like a record by the time the band comes in. And so when they come in for playback, there might be a distressor on the drum group and a mix bus compressor, and that's it. It's the only plugin. That's all I want. So it feels a lot better to me that way.
Yeah.
I think that's my favorite thing about the way that you approach music, Nick. It's how you are very much trying to keep the focus on a great performance, a great song, a great moment in time, but you're not anti-plugins or anti-digital stuff out of spite. You know what I mean? I feel like I feel like most people that appreciate the things that you appreciate are also like adamantly against using things like the music rebalance tool, and I love the fact that you want to do whatever you can to get it to sound as great as it can. But like you said before, the band comes in to even like listen to the take, but you know how to get that great sound, you know how to get a great performance out of them, but also when things could be helped, and when you can help to just like get rid of the parts of the sound that are getting in the way of that performance being as great as it was in the room. And I don't know. I love that best of both worlds. Like, I love your vibe.
You can have your cake and eat
thanks.
it too,
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's like one of those things, like, I don't want to ramble too much, but it's like, people talk a lot about recording to tape, which I enjoy doing. But like, people are like, oh, tape sounds so much better than Pro Tools. I don't know. It's like sometimes, yeah, until the tape machine's broken or you're doing a really quiet song and it's really noisy. It's just another tool. It's another way of recording music. And its beauty of tape is you're not looking at a computer screen, and you have to commit to performances. And if you're really good, you can do punches and splice things together. But most people have kind of lost that art. So it's like, they're all just tools. So we might as well just use them,
Yeah.
And committing to things like feels really good to me.
Yeah. Maybe that's the North Star of this whole thing, is the commitment and not overthinking it. I feel like that's living,
It is.
Committing to the vision, but always trying to have a couple tools in your backpack in case you need to wiggle your way out of a sticky situation that you've accidentally caused.
Which is very important to have.
Epic.
Oh, that's great.
I think we should wrap this stage of the conversation, and we will be continuing this with Nick very shortly, and for the listeners, just a week away. Nick, thank you so much for joining us. This was a blast, and I learned so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure.
Yay, thanks, guys.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. If anything here resonated with you, please share this or your favorite episode with a friend.
And as always, we love to hear from our listeners, so find us on social media at Secret Sonics,
at Ben Wallach Music,
and at Carl Bonner. Until next time, bye, Ben.
Bye, Carl. That was good. I think the outro was great.